Our next speaker is Dave Hamre. And the bio I have for him here says that he spent some time in Utah chasing terns, headed to Alaska for bigger avalanches and other interesting pursuits, and is approaching retirement in a way as the fireweed does in late summer, gently fading, which I think is a wholly inadequate introduction for Dave. Dave has been a pillar of the North American avalanche community for many years. The time in Utah he's referring to, I believe, was ski patrolling at Alta in the 70s. He was a longtime forecaster for the Alaska Railroad and is currently and has for many years run Dave Hamre Associates, a consulting firm that did forecasting applications for many of the major railroads in the U.S. He's contributed to the research community through papers in the ISSW over many decades and has helped a lot of us out with avalanche hazard index, avalanche mapping, program reviews. Has really just done an amazing amount of work in the North American and beyond community. So we're lucky to have two talks from Dave today, and please join me in welcoming Dave Hamre.
Thanks, Ethan. Thank you for the introduction, Ethan. When I was asked to come here, one of the things I talked over with Jason was what topics to talk about. And one of the things he wanted me to touch on was some of the research that we have going. So we have a group called the Transportation Avalanche Research Pool. It's basically a group of DOTs that fund research. We generate maybe $200,000 a year. They can be put to different research projects, and they're very specifically oriented towards applicable research. Research that applies directly to the job that transportation agencies are doing. This is both DOTs and railroads. So I set the stage with this avalanche research project, but we've done several different projects. We have one that's completed as a champion on effective radius of RAX devices. Why is this important? When you put a RAX device in, it's hard to know what density to put them in, and they're quite expensive. So if you put them in at a high density, you're going to pay a lot. And maybe you need to do that, maybe you don't, but you really need to know what the radius, effective radius is of a RAX device. We have another one in the mill in the future for interrupting fracture propagation, which I'll detail on in a little bit. And the one I want to focus on is the effect of explosives use on the, I say avalanche return interval, but what I really mean is avalanche frequency and magnitude. And I suspect that in this room there's a number of people that use explosives to mitigate avalanches. So, are you being effective is the question. First I'll touch on this effective radius issue. This is a diagram from a GIS program where we have overlaid the effective radius of GASX systems, and you can see the different sizes. The 1.5 meter is a much smaller radius than the 3 meter GASX. And interestingly in this, you can see some pretty significant space in between the devices, which does not get affected by the blast radius. It might get affected by fracture propagation, but it doesn't get affected by the blast itself. So that's a sort of an issue, some of the parameters there. And then the second concept touching on real briefly is this issue of interrupting fracture propagation. If you have facilities that are in the way of a large avalanche, large magnitude avalanche, and the concern is that you have a long fracture propagation, which happened here in Colorado, I think in 2019, you had a bunch of long fracture propagation events. These long fractures can make for really big avalanches. And so the conventional approach for highways is to put snow nets across the starting zone. Well, this is both ugly and also is very expensive. So there's a concept out there that I was just trying to figure out who came up with the concept. I'm not sure. I talked to Carl and Ethan about it, but neither one of them really knew. That you could interrupt the fracture halfway through. So here's an example. You'll have to ignore where it is, but conceptually you can see the D3 through D5 sizes, and the bigger the avalanche, the longer it runs, of course, and maybe there's a building at the end of it. But also, the bigger the size, the longer the fracture to the right. So what happens if you can interrupt that fracture from propagating all the way? The dynamics modeling you do can take into consideration only half of that, and it might not run out as far as the larger event would. So instead of putting a series of fences across the slope, maybe one fence going down the slope would interrupt the fracture propagation. This is a concept. It needs a lot of research. So, but Colorado's a great spot to do that, so you might see this set up in the future. But the big thing is, do explosives change the frequency and magnitude relationship? I think there's a commonly held belief that if you use explosives a lot, it's going to result in smaller avalanches and more frequent avalanches. The frequency part is probably true, but there's a lot of questions about whether the magnitude is reduced or not. Some experienced practitioners don't believe that's true. They have different viewpoints than that. And I wanted to point out some of the differences. This is research that is funded but hasn't been contracted yet and is supposed to go forward in the future. So we don't have any answers right now, but I wanted to talk about the concepts that are evident in how we go about accomplishing this task. And why does it make a difference? It makes a difference in terms of racks design. And as I mentioned earlier, they're $250,000 a unit. If you add or subtract 1 or 2 units, that's quite a bit. And so that whole question of what racks or explosives do can be debated amongst people. One of the things that we've found out already is that there's no common parameters for what constitutes high-frequency use of explosives. Is that 30 times a year, or is it 10 times a year? There's no common terms that we use. In some locations, the use of explosives is very occasional, and you wouldn't expect that that's going to change the frequency-magnitude relationship that much. But in other places, it's quite common. So one of the things I wanted to point to was that there was a study on this issue regarding the first GASX installation on Teton Pass that Kelly Elder and Rod Newcomb did in '94. And out of this study, they found that around the GASX units, there was a hardening of the snowpack, but there was also a shallower snowpack, so it resulted in more facet development. So in this particular case, the spacing on the units was quite large. And this is for a highway application, so they were not concerned about skiers triggering avalanches. They were mostly concerned about them triggering avalanches that would go down and hit the highway. So that's why the spacing was large. But here's some of the verbiage straight out of that study, saying that the effects of removing the new snow above the depth hoar before it gains strength, GASX is not effective in removing depth hoar. I thought that was pretty interesting. And it points to some of the issues with using GASX or any kind of explosives. It doesn't matter if it's gas-based or explosives-based. One of the events that highlighted this issue was there was a large release 2 springs ago, and you can see their GASX units above, and the release happened below the GASX units where the effective radius wasn't getting at the snowpack anymore. So it released above, it crossed an open road 2 times, and ran into a beginner ski lift area, and they had to go out and probe for people and that sort of thing. So not a good outcome. Good outcome because nobody was there, so nobody was on the road. The road happened to be closed, but it surprised the forecasters, and these are very experienced forecasters. And I think when you look at the records and you see that they were surprised by this event, I think that says a lot. But I think one of the things they didn't consider was the zone of influence. They said, well, we shot the GAZEX all winter long and we still got an avalanche. Well, that can happen to you. It can happen to anybody. So the use of explosives didn't necessarily preclude that the slope was going to avalanche at a later date. And you know what, the good part is it could have been bigger. It could have been a D3 or a D3.5, just by being longer, bigger, deeper fracture. Could have been a lot worse. So it wasn't. I think what a couple factors that play into here is the terrain angle. You can see that where the GAZEXs are on the left on the terrain angle, and the outline of the avalanche was in the lower part, just where it makes the transition to a shallower angle. So the GAZEX influence didn't really get down into that area. And then I also graphed out the volume on the road of all the avalanche events over the years. There's like 37 or 38 of them. And this was the largest event on record on the road in that 37-year period. Does it represent an unusual event? I don't think so. The R-squared factor is not real good, and the difference between the next smallest event and the largest one is not really high. So what's our research approach to try to determine whether frequency or magnitude is changed by the application of explosives? First of all, we're going to try to work on determining what the explosives, the buckets, what I'm calling buckets of use frequency are. Is that 30 times a year, 10 times a year, once a year? What are the different buckets you want to put things in? And what do you want to call them? So there's a wide range of inputs, and it could be that we call around to ski areas here in Colorado, in some cases, and ask for input on this issue of what would you call the frequency of mitigation. And from that, we can determine which records fit into that frequency in what locations. And we also have to determine a number of locations that have good long-term records. And there was a pitch a few minutes ago about long-term records. This is really important. And most people do not have good records. In order to make this comparison, we have to have a long-term database of both natural avalanches and artificial avalanches, and that's very rare. There's almost no locations that have that background. But there are a few. Alaska Railroad has a reliable database of natural events between 1945 and 1985. That could be adulterated a little bit by climate change, but we're not sure on that issue. But and they now have been mitigating for 40 years. So we have some fairly long-term accurate records we can base on there. Duffy Lake, BC, they have pretty good natural records for 15 or 20 years, and then have sequentially put in a series of GAZEXs. So there's several chutes in the Duffy Lake, BC that we could look at and see what the effects of the explosives are. Little Cottonwood Canyon, of course, is one of the preeminent avalanche situations. Before 1970, roughly nobody did any avalanche mitigation on the lower part of the canyon. So we're looking for the records from avalanche occurrence in the lower part of the canyon to compare to what happened after 72 and see if what the effect of explosives really are. And then right in the backyard, the Seven Sisters avalanche path may be a good candidate too, because the frequency of mitigation has changed significantly on the Seven Sisters path. And finally, next to final, but Snoqualmie Pass in Washington has an interesting problem because they did mitigation for many years and then they built a bridge to bypass and get over the avalanche problem. And now they're just letting naturals run. They've been keeping records for the last 6 years with this thought in mind that they would develop a pattern of how naturals compare to their previously mitigated. So it's sort of a reverse database, but it's a good one. And I just talked to Art about Gothic, Colorado. I thought they had continued their avalanche occurrence records, but apparently they haven't, so I'm not sure that that's a suitable location. We thought it might be a good spot to get an understanding of how climate change is affecting avalanche behavior, but that's a rather difficult issue. So I'll just briefly run through these. Alaska Railroad dispatch logs from 45 to 86 noted the time, date, location, depth, and length on every avalanche for 40 years. And that's an incredible database if you stop and think about it. I'm going to show you a little, you got to have a movie in here, and I'm going to show you this. And I'll warn you that the photographer had a really hard time tracking this avalanche. It got pretty chaotic. And at the end, it blows into a lake and blows that out past the highway. And you'll see the pock marks of ice hitting the Turnagain Arm when it reaches that. He should be panning to the right, but he's not. Oh, it's down there somewhere. Yeah, oh, it's way out to the right, oh my God. Then this is the part I like, it's just, he finally gets on it just as it goes over the road. Now watch the water. You can see the debris hitting the water. And you'll see a tree fly out too. It's a fun little piece of Alaska avalanche. Said I moved north because of bigger avalanches. Little Cottonwood, here you can see the upper part and lower part of the canyon. The lower part was not mitigated prior to 72. A lot of avalanche paths, hopefully we can find the data, or as Andrew alluded to, maybe use some new techniques to get the data out of narratives. Seven Sisters worked with Ethan on that a number of years ago, and we found that the effective rate for closures of the highway, or for the mitigation, has improved a lot over time. So that might be a clue that we can use in a research situation. Snoqualmie, got this bridge, and you've got these avalanche paths, and they used to run under the avalanche paths and there was no bridge, and they get hit and there's lots of mitigation. Now it's just completely naturals, and they're continuing to keep records on those. So we think that's a good proxy, and that's my talk about that issue, if anybody's got questions.
Thanks, Dave. A lot of perspective there. Very interesting research project. Any questions for Dave? Ron has a question. Can we get the microphone for him?
Thanks, Dave. I have a few. I'm going to keep on going until someone else has more questions. You're talking about mitigation frequency across the industry. So are you talking about path-based or area-based, or across the entire industry around the world? When you're talking about high-frequency mitigation work, you're talking about between different years on a specific place?
I think times per year is what I'm thinking of in terms of frequency. Like, what is a lot? If you mitigate a lot, does the effective explosives make the avalanches smaller? There are a lot of forecasters that say that's not true, that, some of the biggest avalanche events on record in Little Cottonwood, as an example, were in the last 2 years from GASXs. They're GASX triggered. So in a 40-year database, that's the largest events. So just trying to figure out what buckets to put things in, because the concept is that the frequent use of explosives would make avalanches smaller. And that may or may not be true. I hate getting questions from these.
We have to take the microphone away from Ron occasionally. But I also have to recognize, Ron, because now that I understand your question about the vertical interruption of fracture propagation, that was Ron.
Good.
And he would never say that himself, so I had to say it for him.
Yeah, good.
Now you can have the microphone back.
How do you think the shot location variabilities would impact the frequency?
I think you need to use that radius, effective radius. And the slope is susceptible to avalanches, it's likely going to get triggered. And I say likely, not absolute, by the pressure on the snowpack from the explosives. And CAIC's paper has those radiuses in it for a lot of different kinds of explosives and devices and that sort of thing. So all those radiuses are different. So placement is, of course, important, but how do you ferret out where there's an instability and you haven't put a bomb? That's always a tricky question, especially in deep slab conditions like you have. I'm not sure, but I'd look pretty carefully at those radiuses. And if you're putting racks devices out, then big storms, you might need to put some hand charges in between them, or heli bomb or something like that.
We have time for one more question.
Thanks for the talk, really interesting stuff. Mine's kind of along the same lines. Are you looking at more complex patterns for racks and explosive deployment to try to break up those slabs? And rather than focusing on those upper start zones, actually deploying that further down into the release zones?
Placement, as was alluded to earlier, is a tricky proposition. Trying to remember. It was Carl and I did a paper on, fracture propagation. And the interesting thing in looking at all these videos was 1/3 of the fractures started, the first time you saw a fracture was at the stock wall. We don't know why. It just is, you know. So would I put a bomb down there? Yeah, I'd put a bomb down lower, but not out of the stock wall area, but down in the meat of it. But I think you really need to look at the effective radius. It's not the triggering. You know, I was in a meeting in France. I think you were there. I'm not sure, but you know, we had a discussion with the head of the GAZEX, the task team, and you know, he was saying, "Well, look at this. This fracture propagated all over here, so it's effective way over here." But that's not the issue. The issue is if a skier goes in to that radius, that effective radius, in theory, their pressure is less than the pressure that's been applied to the surface of the snow. So it shouldn't trigger an avalanche. We don't know if that's true or not, but we've surmised that from the research.
Great, thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Dave. Great talk.